A footman at Buckingham Palace noticed on Monday morning that the king's ceremonial standard had been moved, quietly and without announcement, from its usual place in the king's private study to a smaller room off the main corridor. The footman did not comment. He only continued his morning duties and made a note of the change in his private log. Music. He had worked at Buckingham for 31 years, and he had learned in that time that the smallest visible changes inside the palace almost always meant that something larger had been decided behind closed doors. The palace issued its formal statement at 9 o'clock that morning. The wording was brief, the tone was steady, and the signature at the bottom belonged to the king. King Charles was stepping back from 5 specific royal duties, effective immediately. Prince William would take them over the same morning, and the palace had confirmed in writing that the transition would begin without any ceremony, without any speeches, and without any further public discussion. The 5 duties had been chosen carefully. Each carried significant institutional weight. Each had been carried by the sovereign personally for decades, and each would now become part of the Prince of Wales's daily responsibilities from this day forward. The country would learn what the palace had confirmed within the hour, and Prince William would take on what his father had carried by the end of the afternoon. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles did not move from his desk for almost half an hour after signing the delegation instrument. The king read the wording one final time, folded his hands on the desk, and looked out the tall window that faced the gardens. Charles felt no doubt. He had made his peace with this specific morning almost 2 months earlier, when the 12-month preparation period he had signed the previous year had reached its final quarter. Now, holding the formal delegation document, Charles felt only clarity. A delegation instrument, in plain words, is a formal written document, signed by the monarch, that transfers specific royal duties from the sovereign to another member of the royal family for a defined period of time. This instrument was not an abdication. It was not a regency. It was something more precise. It was a permanent transfer of 5 specific duties from Charles to William, taking effect immediately and continuing indefinitely, alongside a step back from the ceremonial visibility that Charles had, until then, carried personally. The 5 duties were set out clearly. First, the weekly audience with the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom would from that day forward be held by Prince William, with Charles receiving a formal summary of the conversation the following morning. Second, the chairmanship of the Sovereign's Sponsored Institutions Committee, which oversaw the largest set of royal patronages, would move from Charles to William. Third, the formal reception of new ambassadors to the court of St. James's would take place at Kensington Palace with William presiding, not at Buckingham with Charles. Fourth, the king's ceremonial role at the annual Order of the Garter service would be carried out by William. And fifth, the routine signing of certain state instruments would move from Charles's desk to William's. A state instrument, in plain words, is any formal signed document by which the sovereign gives legal effect to a specific act of the crown, from the granting of a royal patronage to the confirmation of a ceremonial appointment. Catherine learned of the finalized instrument the same morning. The princess did not raise her voice. She did not react quickly. Catherine only sat beside William, read the wording carefully, and understood immediately what her husband would begin carrying that afternoon. This was not preparation any longer. This was the actual moment the crown began, in visible institutional terms, to shift onto her husband's shoulders. Anne learned of the signed instrument late that morning. The Princess Royal arrived at Buckingham Palace without an announced appointment. Anne read the 2 pages in the same steady silence that had carried her through every private storm inside the family. When Anne finished, she closed the folder, looked at Charles, and told him only one thing: that the country would carry the change more easily than he was allowing himself to believe. Charles smiled. The king had needed to hear the sentence, even if he had not asked for it. William learned of the signed instrument in the same hour. The prince had been briefed on the wording the previous week, but seeing the final signature, His father's careful handwriting at the bottom of the page carried a different weight than reading the draft had carried. William read the 2 pages twice. He set the document down, and William did not immediately speak. Catherine, beside him, only rested her hand quietly on his sleeve and let the silence carry the weight for both of them. Camilla had known the timing for 2 months. The Queen Consort had, by the previous autumn, made her peace with the shape of the transition. Camilla did not attend the signing that morning. She only sent Charles a short handwritten note, delivered by a single aide, that said one sentence. It said that she was proud of him. Charles read the note, folded it once, and placed it inside his own personal drawer without any further comment. The 4 reactions moved through the palace in a slow, spreading current. Charles felt certainty first, then quiet grief, then the peace of a monarch who had, at last, released the specific duties he had chosen to release. William felt weight first, then honor, then the calm resolve of a man who had spent his whole life preparing for this exact set of responsibilities. Catherine felt sadness first, then love, then the same steady care she always carried when the family stood at an important edge. Anne felt nothing new at all. The Princess Royal had already carried the conclusion inside her since the moment she had first opened the folder. Sophie had, by mid-morning, quietly coordinated every practical piece that would carry the family through the first day. The trusted confidant had reviewed the schedule, briefed the household, arranged the discreet handovers of paperwork, and cleared the corridors where certain private movements would take place that afternoon. Sophie did not need any thanks. She had done this kind of quiet coordination for the family many times before, and she would do it again on days that mattered even more. But the story behind the transition was longer than any one Monday morning, and to understand what Charles was about to release and what William was about to receive, the story had to move backward. This did not begin with a signed delegation instrument. It began nearly 2 years earlier, when Charles had received a private medical review that had changed the shape of his own thinking about the future of the crown. Charles had accepted the review with the calm dignity he had brought to every difficult moment of his reign. But the king had also understood from that first quiet conversation that the crown could not afford an unprepared succession. Charles had reached the throne after a lifetime of preparation, and even then, the early months had carried moments of institutional uncertainty. Charles had promised himself, in that first quiet week, that William would not inherit uncertainty. William would inherit readiness. The formal transition plan had been signed the previous year, after 18 months of careful drafting and review. The plan had set out a 12-month preparation period, during which William would take on expanded institutional responsibilities in a defined sequence. The public announcement had been made, the country had received it with quiet respect, and the 12 months had begun quietly the following week. Across the following year, William had grown into responsibilities that had once seemed impossible to imagine carrying without his father beside him. William had received the full daily red boxes and had read every page. William had chaired specific royal patronage boards and had done so with authority. William had led certain state visits and had received foreign dignitaries with a calm precision that had impressed even the most experienced palace advisors. According to a documented account later prepared for senior aides, William had told a private secretary in month 6 of the preparation period that he had, at last, stopped waking each morning with any doubt about the shape of what he was being prepared for. Anne had watched all of this carefully. The Princess Royal had, in her own steady way, kept a private assessment of William's growing capacity across the 12 months. Anne had noticed the small moments where William's confidence had settled into place, and she had noticed the specific weeks where his authority had begun to carry the kind of quiet weight that only came from repeated practice. Anne had reported her observations to Charles only twice across the year. Both reports had said the same thing: William was ready. Anne had not needed to elaborate further. Camilla had, throughout the 12 months, quietly stepped back from certain ceremonial visibility that she had held earlier in the reign. The Queen Consort had not been asked to make the change. She had made it herself. Camilla had understood from an early stage that the transition would be easier for the country to receive if her own visible role softened at the same pace that William's grew. She had accepted the shift without any reluctance, and by the 12th month, Camilla's schedule had settled into the supportive pattern the transition plan had, from the beginning, imagined for her. Catherine had, in her own way, done exactly the opposite. The princess had steadily increased her own public visibility, precisely so that William would never appear on the public stage alone in the new phase. Catherine had taken on additional charitable patronages, additional state visits, and additional ceremonial duties that would frame her, quietly and consistently, as the standing figure beside William in every public appearance. According to a private palace briefing prepared for the senior household in early autumn, Catherine's growing visibility had been one of the smoothest and most helpful institutional shifts of the entire preparation period. Charles had, meanwhile, been thinking carefully about which specific duties he would release first. The king had not wanted to release too many at once. He had also not wanted to release so few that the transition would look symbolic rather than substantive. Charles had asked a small circle of senior advisors to help him identify the 5 duties whose transfer would carry the greatest signal to the country, while still leaving the king with a clear, dignified, continuing role. Those consultations had taken 3 months, and by the end of the 10th month of the preparation period, the specific list of 5 duties had been finalized. The king had, at that point, asked for one specific consideration to be built into the transfer. Charles had asked that no ceremony accompany the actual handover. He had wanted the transition to happen quietly, without any public spectacle, without any speeches, and without any performance of grief or celebration. Charles had believed from the earliest weeks of his reign that the crown was served best when its most important moments passed without noise. And he had wanted this specific morning to embody that belief. William had accepted every part of the plan. The prince had not asked for any change, any softening, or any additional accommodation. William had quietly and repeatedly told his father that the wording, the timing, and the specific list of duties were all as he wished them to be. Charles had, at each of those quiet conversations, thanked William with a nod and had said nothing further. Neither of them had needed to say more. There had been one small final pause. 2 weeks before the signing, Charles had asked William whether he wished for the morning to include any specific private ritual between the two of them. William had thought about it for 2 days. Then William had asked whether Charles might give him something that had been used to sign state instruments in the past, so that the moment would carry a physical anchor beyond the paperwork itself. Charles had agreed without hesitation. He had known immediately what he would give William. The object Charles had chosen was a specific fountain pen that had been used to sign state instruments since well before Charles's own ascension. The pen had been used by his grandfather, George VI. It had been used by his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, throughout her long reign, and it had been used by Charles himself since his own ascension. According to a documented account later prepared for senior aides, the pen had been kept, quietly and without ceremony, inside a small leather case in the top drawer of the sovereign's personal desk at Buckingham Palace. It had never been photographed. It had never been named in any public statement. But every state instrument signed with that pen had carried, in a very small and private way, the continuity of 3 generations. Charles had decided that this pen would be William's from this morning forward. The gift would not be announced. The country would never learn of it directly. But William would know. And William's own son, one day, would receive it from William in the same private way, carrying the continuity forward through 4 generations, then 5, then 6. That was why the story had reached this specific Monday morning. Not because any single day had forced the timing, not because any single event had triggered it, but because a 12-month preparation had at last arrived at the shape it had always been building toward. And once Charles had signed the delegation instrument, the story had no choice but to return to the present. Charles asked for a small private gathering at Buckingham Palace at 10 o'clock that Monday morning. The king did not use the formal channel. Charles asked quietly for William, Catherine, and Anne to arrive at his private study, and for no aides to be present inside the room. Camilla had not been asked to attend. She had asked gently whether she might be nearby without being in the room itself, and Charles had agreed. Camilla had chosen to sit alone in a small drawing room down the corridor, quietly, for the duration of the meeting. A private family gathering, in plain words, is a small, unofficial meeting held between close members of the royal family without any staff involvement. This was not a formal handover. It was the moment before the formal handover. Anne arrived first. The Princess Royal did not speak as she waited. William and Catherine arrived together. William did not sit down immediately. He stood near the desk looking at the delegation instrument that lay open, face up with his father's signature at the bottom of the second page. Catherine stood close to him, her hand resting quietly against his sleeve. Charles arrived last and took his place at his desk, but he did not sit. He remained standing on the other side of the desk from William, so that only the paperwork lay between them. Charles did not open with any introduction. The king simply looked at William for a long moment, then reached into the top drawer of his desk and took out a small leather case. Charles opened the case. Inside was a single fountain pen, dark green in color, with a small worn gold detail at its cap. Charles closed the case again, held it briefly in both hands, and then placed it on the desk in front of William. Charles spoke only 3 sentences. He told William that the pen had been used by his grandfather George VI, by his mother Queen Elizabeth II, and by himself. He told William that the pen had signed every state instrument that had passed across the sovereign's desk for more than 80 years, and he told William that the pen was his now, to use for the duties he would begin carrying that afternoon. William did not speak for a long moment. The prince felt the weight of the object arrive before the words did. William had understood before that morning that a small physical gift would be given, but he had not known which object his father had chosen. Holding the case in his own hands for the first time, William understood immediately what it meant to receive a pen that had crossed 4 generations of the same family. William opened the case slowly. He looked at the pen, closed the case again, and placed it inside his own breast pocket. William did not thank his father aloud. That would have been too small. William only nodded once, quietly, and told Charles that he understood what he had just been given. Anne watched, quietly. The Princess Royal did not add anything to the moment. She only stood at a respectful distance and let the exchange between father and son carry itself. Then Catherine spoke. The princess did not raise her voice. Catherine simply looked at Charles across the desk, then at William beside her, and said the line that would carry through the rest of the morning. "This is what love for the crown looks like." The words were short, the words were exact, and the words landed in the room with a weight no signature could match. Catherine had not defended anything. She had not praised anything. She had only named what she had watched Charles do that morning. Charles had stepped back not because he had grown too old to continue, and not because he had grown too tired to carry the crown. Charles had stepped back because he loved the crown more than he loved holding it. And Catherine had understood before anyone else in the room could say it aloud, that the pen crossing the desk was the truest gesture of love that a monarch could make. Charles received Catherine's words carefully. The king did not respond. He only looked at his daughter-in-law for a long moment, then looked at William, then looked at Anne. Charles had not expected the sentence, but he understood immediately why Catherine had spoken it. Catherine felt sadness first, then love, then the same steady care she always carried when the family stood at an important edge. Charles felt certainty first, then quiet grief, then the peace of a monarch who had, at last, released what he had chosen to release. William felt weight first, then honor, then the resolve of a man who had received something no signature could ever fully capture. Anne felt nothing new at all. The Princess Royal had already carried the conclusion inside her since the moment she had first read the delegation wording. Charles closed the meeting quietly. The king did not deliver any formal speech. He only reminded the room that the weekly audience with the Prime Minister would take place at Kensington that afternoon, with William presiding, and that the palace's formal statement had already been released to the country an hour earlier. Then Charles walked around the desk, embraced William briefly and steadily, and released him. William walked out of the study with Catherine at his side. Anne followed a moment later. Camilla was waiting in the small drawing room down the corridor. She rose to her feet when Charles passed her doorway, and the two of them stood together, quietly, for several minutes before the day's public work began. William stood inside the small study at Kensington Palace that afternoon, holding the leather case in his left hand and the delegation instrument in his right. The prince did not open either. He only stood at the window that looked out onto the palace gardens and let his own private moment settle before the first duty of the new arrangement began. The Prime Minister was scheduled to arrive at Kensington within the hour. William would receive him there, and, for the first time in the country's history, the weekly audience of the sovereign would take place inside Kensington Palace, with the Prince of Wales presiding on the King's behalf. A weekly audience, in plain words, is the private meeting held between the monarch and the head of government, during which matters of state are discussed under conditions of complete confidentiality. This tradition had, until that morning, been carried by every sovereign personally without delegation for more than a century. The transfer of this specific duty to William was, in institutional terms, the single most significant piece of the morning's delegation. Catherine joined William at the window a half-hour before the Prime Minister was due to arrive. The princess did not speak for a long time. She only stood beside her husband, holding his elbow gently, and let the small quiet moment pass between them without interruption. When Catherine did finally speak, her voice was quiet. She only reminded William that his father had said once that no one carried the weekly audience alone. The tradition of the audience carried itself, and the sovereign only guided it. William nodded. The prince had heard his father say this before, but he had needed to hear Catherine say it that afternoon. Anne arrived a short time later, without any prepared purpose. The Princess Royal did not come to advise. Anne only came to confirm the practical arrangements one final time. She told William that the Prime Minister had been briefed by the Cabinet Office the previous evening on the small changes to protocol that the new location and the new principal would require. She told William that the audience would be recorded, as always, only by the two participants' personal notes, and that no aide would be present during the private conversation itself. And she told William that Sophie had personally reviewed the security arrangements for the Prime Minister's arrival, so that no photographer would be permitted to record the entry or exit at Kensington that day. William received the practical details the same way he had received all of the previous month's briefings. He nodded, thanked Anne quietly, and returned to the window. Then Anne said one more thing, and she said it plainly. According to a later documented account prepared for senior aides, the Princess Royal told William that his father had, throughout his reign, treated the weekly audience as the most important single conversation of his week. Charles had prepared for each audience with an intensity that few outside the household had ever fully understood. And Charles had asked Anne to remind William, if the moment arose that afternoon, that a weekly audience was not a briefing. It was a conversation between two people who each carried a specific responsibility for the country. William understood. Anne did not need to explain further. Charles arrived at Kensington 20 minutes before the Prime Minister was due. The King did not come to sit in on the audience. He only came to be nearby for the moment William began. Charles sat in a small drawing room 2 doors down from the study William would use. Sophie sat with him quietly. Neither of them spoke much. Charles only wanted to be present in the same building at the moment the specific duty first passed to his son. That was all he needed. Catherine walked William to the doorway of the study a few minutes before the Prime Minister's arrival. The princess did not say anything at the doorway itself. She only smiled at William briefly, kissed his cheek, and stepped away. William entered the study alone. The Prime Minister arrived on time. William received him inside the study with the same calm precision he had brought to every prior state occasion. He gestured his guest to a chair, sat down opposite him, and opened the conversation with a small, careful question about the Prime Minister's own family. That single question set the tone. It made clear that William would carry the audience with the same personal warmth his father had carried it with, in the same tradition his grandmother had carried it before him. The audience lasted just under 55 minutes. Neither William nor the Prime Minister emerged with any visible tension. William walked his guest to the door of the study, thanked him, and returned to his desk. He sat down. He opened the leather case in front of him. He took out the pen his father had given him that morning, and William made his own private notes on the conversation in his own hand, with the pen that had crossed 4 generations of the family before him. William closed the notebook when he was finished. He placed the pen carefully back into its case. He closed the case, placed it inside the top drawer of the study desk, and turned the small key in the lock. Then William stood up, walked slowly to the window, and looked out at the palace gardens for a long moment. Catherine was standing at the far end of the corridor waiting. William walked toward her. She took his hand as he reached her, and the two of them walked back toward their private quarters quietly, without any conversation between them. By the end of the day, the reactions inside the family had settled into a quiet, weighted stillness. Anne felt steadied, not celebratory. Charles felt tired, not diminished. William felt heavier, not smaller. Catherine felt protective, not fearful. The first duty of the new arrangement had passed successfully, and no member of the family carried any doubt about the shape of what was to come. The first day had begun. The palace's formal statement had been released to the country at 10 o'clock that morning, an hour before the private family gathering had ended. The wording was brief, the tone was steady, and the signature at the bottom belonged to the king. The statement confirmed the transfer of 5 specific royal duties to Prince William, effective immediately, and stated that the transition would be carried out without ceremony, without speeches, and without any further public discussion beyond the palace's formal confirmation itself. A palace formal statement, in plain words, is a short official announcement issued by the palace to make an institutional decision clearly known to the country at a specific hour. This one mattered because its wording had been chosen carefully to communicate substance without spectacle. The country would understand what had happened. The country would not be asked to celebrate or mourn it. The palace had wanted the moment to be received with the calm dignity that Charles had, throughout his reign, held above almost every other institutional value. A major newspaper carried the story under one careful headline that spread across every screen by midday. William steps forward. The king steps back. A national newspaper headline, in plain words, is the short, bold sentence at the top of a story that shapes how the public will read everything below it. This one mattered because it named both actions in a single balanced line, framing the moment as an act of mutual dignity rather than a diminishment of one man or an elevation of another. The country did not receive the announcement with alarm. The country received it with quiet respect. Most viewers had followed Charles's reign with warmth, had watched the previous year's preparation period unfold with careful public attention, and had begun to understand, without needing to be told directly, that the palace had been building toward this specific kind of moment for some time. The announcement gave shape to what the country had already begun to expect. A national broadcaster framed the whole moment with one line during a midday bulletin. A national bulletin, in plain words, is a short news update read out at fixed times of day, meant to give the whole country the same version of the story at the same moment. The broadcaster said only this: "The crown has passed a portion of its weight, without changing hands." That sentence traveled quickly. It did not carry alarm. It only named what the palace had confirmed. Outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd began to gather with British flags and quiet expressions of respect. Buckingham mattered because it was the seat of the king's authority, and the flags made the story feel less like an announcement and more like a country expressing its steady confidence in the transition. Older visitors nodded to one another. Younger ones stood with their hands folded quietly. No one shouted, no one protested. The silence outside those gates carried its own kind of trust. Prince William did not appear publicly that afternoon. The prince had spent the day at Kensington, receiving the Prime Minister and completing the private paperwork that accompanied the day's transitions. But William did appear briefly on the palace's own communications channels that evening. He offered a single short written line, released with the palace's evening summary. "I will carry what my father has carried." The prince said nothing else. He did not need to. By evening, a second broadcaster framed the story with the line that would carry the longest. "This was not a step down. It was a step across." That sentence traveled further than the first. It did not exalt anyone. It did not humble anyone. It only named what had happened, in language the country could carry home. And inside the palace, the household understood that the story had passed beyond their reach. The public had received the transition. The country had accepted the change, and no further explanation would be needed. Charles signed one final internal document the following morning. The king did not summon a large audience. Charles simply sat inside his private study, read the wording twice, and signed. The paper confirmed a new palace protocol. A private palace protocol, in plain words, is an internal royal rule that controls how sensitive family matters are handled behind palace doors. This one mattered because it formalized the working arrangement between Charles and William for the years ahead. Certain duties would remain with the king. Certain duties had passed to William, and the protocol set out, in careful institutional detail, how the daily practical relationship between the two roles would be carried. The protocol confirmed that Charles would continue to hold, personally, 3 specific duties for as long as his health allowed. He would remain the sovereign in all constitutional and legal senses. He would continue to receive the daily summaries of state affairs, and he would continue to be the visible head of the family at the most significant state occasions of the year. Beyond those 3, all remaining routine duties of the sovereign would move to William across the following 12 months, in a defined sequence agreed by Charles, William, and Anne. Anne read the protocol and offered no changes. The Princess Royal only signed her own copy and returned it the same afternoon. Anne did not celebrate the outcome. She only felt quiet relief that the working arrangement had been placed on paper before any future difficulty could challenge it. William received his own copy in the presence of Catherine. The princess did not comment. Catherine only watched William sign and understood, without needing to say it, that a working relationship had been formalized that would carry her husband steadily through the transition years ahead. Camilla accepted the protocol with quiet steadiness. The queen consort did not ask for any change to her own role in the arrangement. She only signed her acknowledgement and returned it the same day. Camilla had made her peace with the timeline months earlier, and that peace held without any strain on the day the protocol was signed. Anne offered the final judgment inside a quiet corridor at Buckingham Palace. The Princess Royal spoke to Charles with the plain, steady tone that had carried the whole story. Anne told her brother that a crown carried across a lifetime was not lightened by the sharing of it, but a crown shared across a family was made steadier by the sharing. Charles nodded. The monarch understood the message. The story reached its final truth inside those words. A family can survive a transition. A family cannot survive a transition it has not prepared for or has refused to acknowledge. The monarchy did not weaken that week. The monarchy only demonstrated again that its most important moments carried their weight best when the family had done the quiet work in advance. William had taken over key royal duties. Charles had stepped back with dignity, but Catherine had named the truth about what Charles's stepping back had actually meant. Anne had drawn the practical shape steadily. Camilla had accepted her softened role without reluctance. And Charles, at last, had watched his son sit across from the Prime Minister in a study where he had once sat, holding a pen that carried 4 generations of continuity forward. The palace had confirmed. William had taken over. Charles had stepped back. And behind the quiet paperwork of a single Monday morning, an entire family had, at last, watched the crown steady itself onto new shoulders, without changing what the crown itself had always been. If this story moved you, please take one moment to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next chapter of the royal family's most private struggles. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next video.